Hello, all you processing users. Today we're going to be talking about arrays. And I think the best beginning point for an array is to visualize what the program is thinking about when it uses one. So an array is a list of different objects. It can be text, it can be images, sounds, videos. It doesn't really matter what those things are, but it's a list of individualized points of data. So in this case, we're going to start with an example of using names. If this were an array of names, it would have 5 items in it: John, Cara, Theo, Allison, and Ella. Now, it's one thing to say that we have just a bunch of names, but it's another thing to say that every name is assigned a number. So in this case, the name John is assigned 0, and then 1, and then 2, all the way to 4. Now you'd think the first one was numbered 1, but it always starts with a 0. The first item in an array is always the 0th item and not the first item. So that's one kind of gotcha to keep an eye out for. Now, what is the advantage of having numbers associated with these points of data? Well, the first thing would be if you've used a for loop before, and many of you probably have at this point, a for loop starts at a number and goes upwards. In this case, if we had a for loop that started at 0 and ran until the loop was, as long as the loop was less than 5, then each time through the loop we could access a different name. So if we wanted to visually draw these in a sketch, we could say, all right, make a for loop from 0 to 5, essentially. And then the first time around, I equals 0, then we write down John. Next time around, I equals 1, then we write down Cara. I is 2, Theo, I is 3, Allison, etc. Another really convenient way is because we have numbers associated with these. If we wanted to randomly pull a number, well, we could say, hey, let's randomly grab a number between 0 and 5. We're going to round it down to the lower integer, the lower number when we choose a random number. And then, when we click the mouse button, say we might get the name Theo, or then we might get Ella or John or Cara. It really doesn't matter. So there's some definite advantages to arrays. Now let's go ahead in processing and learn how to write. We'll start with names. As I mentioned, you can do this with images, with other types of data, numbers, most certainly. But for now, we'll start with names. So I'm going to do the standard void setup. And I realize I'll make this font a little bit bigger so it's easier to see. And I'll just restart this. You can always change your font size in the processing preferences, but if you do it, you always want to restart the program, or else things get a little bit funny. Okay, so we've got our processing file. I'm going to do my normal void setup and void draw. And in the void setup, I'll just go ahead and set the size to be 900 by 600. And in the void draw, we're not going to worry about that part yet. So in order to start out, we always have to declare a variable at the top, which is going to be the array itself. Okay, so we're always going to put, when we make an array, we're always going to put the type of data that the array is going to hold. If it's going to be a bunch of numbers, you might say int or float. If it's images, you'd say pimage. But in this case, we're doing text. So if you recall, the data type for a piece of text in processing is called a string. So string. Second up, we're going to put in a open and close bracket. Now that open and close square bracket always tells us in almost every computer program, hey, we're talking about an array here. And then we can put in the name of the array, and I'm going to call mine names. Okay, so you have different options. You could load the names into the array later, or if you know what they all are at this point, which I do, we could always just say equals, and if this works especially well if you're dealing with text, we'll open a curly bracket and we'll put the names in between double quote marks. So there's quote, John, end quote, and then every single item is separated by a comma. So John, and then I'm going to say Abby, and I'm going to say Bill, and I'll just go ahead and add a couple more names in here. It really doesn't matter how many we have. And I'll say Carrie. Okay. So here we go, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there's essentially 7 names, but they're internally, the logic is that the first one is numbered 0, the second one is 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way through 6. Okay, so now we have this array called names. And again, we know it's an array because we put this bracket in here. So how the access to those arrays work is we can refer to these by saying the word names, open up a square bracket, and then put in the index number for whatever that name is. So that might be John, that might be Abby, etc. So let's go ahead and I'll show you what I mean. In the void draw, I'm going to put in a background and put in the number 0 in the parentheses. That means it will draw black. If you recall, 255 is white, and you can do any number in between to get a shade of gray. And if I want to draw a piece of text, I can actually just say text, open parentheses. Now how this normally works with text is if you put anything in quote marks like hello users, that's in quote marks, and then we'll put a comma in the XY location of where this is going to draw out. 50 pixels down, 50 pixels over, 100 pixels down. So those 3 parameters are all we really need. If I run this, let's see, forgot a semicolon at the end of that. When I run this, let's see if we get some little message that says, hey, there we go, hello users, 50 pixels over, 100 pixels down. There's what I put in quote marks. Now that's what you might consider a static piece of text that's always going to be the same there if we run this program over and over again. But if we want to dynamically pull a different name, well, we have an array here called names. So instead of putting this thing in quote marks, we happen to know that we already have all these other names in quote marks here. So I'm instead going to say names, which again is what we're calling our array, and then open the block quote. And if I were to put in the number 0, that would be the 0th item in the array, which is John. So let's try it. 0 and block quote. We'll run that. Okay, the 0th item in the array, and we get the name John. If we were to change this from names 0 to names 2, remember this is the 0th, the 1st, and the 2nd. Now we should get the name Bill, which is quite different. All right, there we go. So this is actually rather convenient. Let's say we want to grab a random number, or random number, which is associated with the index number of each of these items. Well, first of all, it'd be really useful to know how many you have. Now, you could count these by hand, but let's say you had a bank of 800 names. It'd be really inconvenient to individually count them. Instead, we could find out through a built-in term of what's called the length of this array. The length means how many items. So you can always do that by, I'll do it in the void setup here. I'm going to do it in the void setup because then it only happens once. Remember, you can always use the term print line or println to spit a little message out in the black part of the window here. So if I did a print line that said in quote marks, hi, close quote marks, put a semicolon at the end, and I run this program. The first time I run it, down here it says hi once, and it doesn't actually show up in your sketch. That's really important to notice. There's no text showing hi. This is just for the developer, for whoever's writing the code. So instead of just putting a little piece of text in here, let's instead find out what names, case sensitive, names.length is. Okay, names.length. And again, the dot length, it turns blue because that's a built-in term. That's a property of this array, of any array, and it says how many items do you have. I'll hit the play button, and hey, look, there are 7 items. It's very subtle, but it's a little number down here in the bottom left. So, the nice thing is that that number is 7, but if I were to add more names, that would grow alongside with this name. So this is a dynamic way to always grab however many number of items are in your array, regardless if you change to add more or remove some later. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to randomly pull a number whenever you click on a mouse, and that's going to change what gets drawn here. Okay, so we're going to do one more thing. I'm going to, up here at the very top of the program, I'm going to create a new string, and I'm going to call this text holder. And I'm going to start the text holder to say test. Okay, that's just going to be a starting point. The purpose here is that when we randomly generate a number, we're going to have text holder essentially store whatever name that we randomly pull out of this array. So then we can draw it. And I'll show you what I mean. So we have the single text holder here. It's set to test. So when we're going to do our drawing in our sketch, let's go ahead and now say, hey, we always want to draw this piece of text called text holder. So right now when we hit play, that should spit out the word test. But when we click a mouse button, we want to change what text holder is. We're going to change it out of being test and instead have it hold one of these names. So when you ever want to use a mouse click in a processing sketch, there's a nice built-in function here called mouse pressed. And that's when the mouse goes down, this function fires off once. So the function is we want to say, hey, text holder equals, okay, and it used to be test. Now this time we want to refer to something in this names array. So if I were to put names and the number 3 here, for example, that would pull the 4th name in the array, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. That would be Joseph. And if I clicked once now, text holder would always spit out Joseph. But instead of it always being the number 3, we want this to be a random number each time. Well, how do you make a random number? The idea here is that we can type in the word random, all in lowercase. And then if you put in a number here, a single digit, it will randomly pick a number between 0 and that digit. Well, we know that there are 7 items in the array, so we could say random 7. But again, later on we might add more names to it. You might feel inspired to make a larger bank of words. So the much smarter thing would be to say, instead of 7, names.length. Because if you recall, that's spat out 7 for us last time, but if we add more names, then names.length will give you a more updated number for however many items are in the array. Okay, so that's good. This is going to give us a random number between 0 and, in this case, 7, or however many items are in the array. The only problem with this is we'll get an error if we run this, because when it randomly picks a number, it'll let you do decimal-based numbers. Okay, so it's picking between 0 and 7, so the first time you click it might be 6.218, and the next time it might be 0.7432. So they're fraction or decimal-based numbers. So if we want to round this down to the nearest integer, or to the integer below, we can just say int and put anything that's non-integer into parentheses. That will convert this number, which is what's referred to as a float or a decimal-based number. It's going to convert this decimal-based number to round it down to the nearest integer. Alright, so now that we've got that, let's run it, and I'll explain it one more time in case this is confusing. So text holder starts out as test. I click my mouse button, it randomly chooses a number from a number associated with that array, and now text holder is equal to that new name. Every time I click, it's a different name. Okay. Let me try one more thing. It's kind of hard to see. I think there's a built-in little property here. We can say text size and set the size of our font. 30 point. Should be a little bit bigger. All right. Good. So that is the way to do it. Now I'm going to explain this one more time. As a reminder, I have an array here called names. The type of data in the array are all strings or text, and when you make the array, every name here or every piece of text will be in quote marks for each item with a comma separating each one. Internally, it's thinking about there being this numbering system of the first item in the array always being called item number 0, 1, 2, and it always grows upwards in that orientation. And in our sketch here, I am just using this temporary thing called text holder that's going to be essentially just holding whatever piece of text we want to display. Right now it's called test, so when we run the program, test will be what shows up. But when you click on the mouse button by hitting the void mouse pressed, text holder is going to change. And what it's going to change to is we're going to choose a random number between 0 and however many items are in that array, which in our case right now is 7. So 0 to 7 is being called right here. But that number is decimal based. We need it to be a whole number. So the best way to round it down is just to say, hey, I want to take whatever number we have in here and convert it to an integer. So int is the best way to do that. It'll kind of call the stuff between its two parentheses and round it down. Now that we have that as a number, it'll either be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. Remember, because it's always rounding down. So now that we have 0 through 6 as whole numbers or integers, that fits perfectly with assigning text holder to be one of our 7 names. And remember, the 7 names are associated starting with 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's why when we click, we're getting random names. All right, very good. So what else can we do here? Well, I might as well show you how to use an array inside of a for loop, right? And if you haven't done any for loop work, there's a good exercise on how to do it, and I'll leave a link to that. But a for loop. So we're going to draw essentially not just one name in here. Let's draw all the names. Okay. So if you recall, a for loop works by writing the name for, and you're always going to initialize this by saying int, and then I'm going to start mine as I, set it to 0. Okay. And now we're going to tell the second parameter in the for loop is how long is this loop going to run until? And as long as I is less than a certain number. Now that number in this case is going to be however many items are in the array. And we happen to have a nice way to dynamically pull what that is, and that's the name of the array dot length. So I can say I is less than names dot length. In this case, I is less than 7. Semicolon I plus plus. The plus plus means every time the loop runs, I is going to grow by one number. So if I used to be 3, I plus plus would make 3 into a 4, and the 4 into a 5. It'll grow by 1. This is called incrementing. All right, now that we have that for loop written, and that's the correct syntax for what we're going to do, we're going to open up a curly bracket, and then the stuff that's going to take place through each iteration of the loop is going to be in between it and the closing curly bracket. So now if I ran this program just as is, it would write this piece of text called text holder 7 times, and it's all going to draw them in the same place. Okay, so let's start this out simply. If we want to spread these out vertically, these 7 pieces of text, then we'd want to deal with whatever dictates the vertical position of the text, which in this case is the second number. Remember, this is the x position, and this is the y position. So instead of drawing this at 100, we could say, well, let's draw it at 100 plus, every time this thing goes through its loop, I is going to grow by 1. First time I is 0, the second time I is 1. That means that we can use the letter I, which is changing as our loop grows, to instigate change within the loop here. So where the text gets drawn is going to be at 100 pixels down plus I times 20. The I times 20 part means that every time the loop goes through, this text will be drawn 20 pixels lower and lower than the last one. Okay, so let's just run it and see if we see the word test being drawn all over the place. Okay, there we go. Here's the first one in the loop. Second time the loop goes through, we shift 20 pixels down, draw test again. 20 pixels down, test again, and so on. Okay, if 20 is not big enough, we can do 40. We'll rerun it. It should be a little bit bigger. More space. Okay, so there we're kind of using a for loop and using the length of the array, but now we're actually just having it spit out the same piece of text every time. If instead you wanted to draw every single name that we have, instead of using text holder, hey, we already have our array called names, and as the index number that goes in, let's just use the letter I, because if you recall, I starts at 0, and then goes to 1 and 2 and 3, and luckily our arrays starts at 0 and 1 and 2 and 3, all the way up to 7. So that should work out just right. We'll hit the play button. There we go. There's our whole list. The 0th item in the names array, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th. There they all are. Okay, so that's really convenient. That may be of use for some of you as well. Let me do one more thing, which is I want to, for now I'm going to not use the for loop, so I'll just comment out the end curly bracket, comment out the first part, and I'm going to go back to this randomizing idea that we had before. So remember, we were just using text holder is assigning to that random name. The only different thing here is that I'd like to have it draw this piece of text at wherever my mouse is located. So instead of drawing it 50 pixels down and 50 pixels over and 100 pixels down, we'll just say draw at mouse X and mouse Y. And the second thing I'd like to do is I'm going to remove the background out of the void draw, because that's going to essentially wipe out a clean slate every time. And in the void setup, I'm going to put the background in here. So now it's going to paint black once, and whatever happens in the draw is going to kind of remain there. It's not going to disappear. And finally, I'm actually just going to take the text part, which is drawing the text. I'm going to take it out of the void draw and put it in the void mouse pressed. So look what's happening. We've got nothing in the void draw. All the magic is going to happen in the void mouse pressed. So let's go ahead and run the program. Big black sketch. I left click and I get a name, randomly choosing what the names are, located where my mouse is. Right now you'll notice the text is left justified. If you don't like that, if you prefer it aligns to a center where your mouse is, and that's a personal preference thing, I could instead say up in the void setup something just called text align, open a parentheses, and then all in caps you put which direction it's aligned to. In this case I'll just say align to the center, all in caps. Rerun that. Okay, now it centers up where my mouse is. Not bad. Let's do one more thing. Let's say whenever you click, it's going to choose a random size for the font. Right now they're all the same font size. They're all set to 30, which is what I set it to in the void setup. So instead of that, in the void mouse pressed, remember this call is only happening when you click the mouse button. Let's go back to this idea of text size, but in parentheses here, let's re-randomize something. Okay, now we've already done random before, so you can put the word random. If you put in just a single number, it'll randomly choose between 0 and that number. But hey, listen, you might want a certain range you want to randomize between. Let's say I want my font to be between 20 and 50 point font. You can always put in 2 values with a comma between them. And when you do that, it'll randomly choose between 10 and 50. Now, will text size allow us to have a float in between the 2 parentheses instead of an integer? Will it let a decimal base number be in there? And I think the answer is yes. Okay, so there's a different size every time we click. Very interesting. Okay, so this might help us get some digital poetry going if you want to randomly choose stanzas of a poem, or names or adjectives versus nouns and verbs, etc. Very good. Now one more thing that's just I want to show you one dramatic ending to this, which is right now everything's happening on a void mouse press. The mouse has to go down in order for one of these functions to call. Instead, if you were to change void mouse press to void mouse moved, it'll call this this function every time there's a change in one of the mouse pixel positions, which is to say this is going to fire off a lot more often now. I'll hit the play button. Ready for it? 1, 2, and I move my mouse. Okay, we're essentially drawing with text now, because every time there's a change in the pixel's position or the mouse's position, it's going to draw a new name. Okay, and this also shows you how fast the program's running. All right, very good. So there we have working with arrays and text. In the next part of the tutorial, we'll be doing working with arrays and images.